Right, so we finished the last video with a discussion of beneficence and non-malfeasance. We're going to now move on to justice. And this principle is the idea that it is important to treat people fairly, but more importantly, to design research so that its burdens and benefits are shared equitably, or the people who are involved in the research and exposed to the risk are also likely the population that's going to benefit. So, for example, it is not ethical to use prisoners as, say, for example, we were looking for a convenient population upon which to test the COVID-19 vaccines, and we didn't know if the risks were justifiable. So we decided to use prisoners. Well, that wouldn't be fair because the benefits are not afforded only to prisoners, right? So that prisoners would be unduly burdened with the risks, whereas the benefits would be much broader. So with prison populations, the only research that can be done is research that has the potential to benefit a prison population. So the idea is that we need to select subjects equitably and fairly, and we need to avoid exploitation of vulnerable populations or populations of convenience. All right, so I've been mentioning institutional review boards, or IRBs, and these are committees that were established to review and approve research involving human subjects. So it is their job to look at a rationale for the study, the recruitment process, the procedures that are going to be done, the anticipated risks, the anticipated benefits, how informed consent will get obtained, what the measures are. And make a determination about whether the anticipated benefits of the study outweigh the risks, or whether the risks are justified by the anticipated benefits. And in doing so, ensuring that all human subjects research is conducted in accordance with the ethical principles that are outlined in the Belmont Code. In fact, the Belmont Code that has informed what's called the Common Rule, which is the Code of 45, Code of Federal Regulations 46, which is sort of the federal guidelines for how IRBs should review and interpret research. So in order to ensure that the committee is qualified to actually review research, and in particular to make sure that this research is done in an ethical manner, the committee is actually made up of a variety of different types of people. So there have to be members of the scientific community, so scientists and researchers, and this makes sense since it's our job to evaluate the degree to which the study is adequately designed to meet its aims. Any study that's not designed to meet its aims only has risk and no benefit, and therefore can't be approved, as well as the degree to which the specific scientific procedures are being done competently and ethically. It also has to have non-scientific members, right? So these would be people who aren't as familiar with scientific process, but can sort of speak from the perspective of a research subject. What would it be like as a non-scientist participating in a research study? We also need community members, so people who actually represent the community from which participants are being drawn. And then there's also a chairperson whose job it is to oversee the committee. Other things that need to be often taken into account is to have people who have expertise with the population or the procedures that are being done. So for example, if a study is being done with prisoners, then there's an expectation that a prisoner advocate be available. If you're working with kids who are in foster care, then or who are orphans, then it might be necessary to have a child advocate on the committee. If you're doing a medical study, it might make sense to have someone with a medical background. And so it is on the chairperson in particular to make sure that that representation is addressed, given the nature of the studies that are being reviewed. So the last thing I wanted to briefly go over, although this looks like a lot of information, it is the process of informed consent. And out of the Code of Federal Regulations that I mentioned, there are specific required elements that must go into an informed consent form. As an IRB member, one of the things that I spend the most time on is looking at the informed consent and ensuring that the document includes all of the required elements. So the first is that the person must be informed that they're being recruited to participate in an actual research study, right? So thinking about Tuskegee, those individuals were never told that they were participants in a research study. An explanation of the purpose of the research and procedures that will be followed. So it's important that the person knows, why is the study being done? What are the anticipated benefits of this? And what can they expect to happen? Will there be blood draws? Will they be injected with something? Will they be required to endure some kind of physical or psychological discomfort? Might they be deceived about the procedures? What's their expected duration of participation? So again, you think about the Tuskegee experiment, many of these men were involved for 40 years. They didn't even know they were part of a study. So most of the research that we do here lasts at most an hour or so, but sometimes participation might be long term. So some of the research that I've done in the past, participation was expected to last somewhere between 6 and 12 months. Identification of any procedures which are quote unquote experimental, meaning, for example, something that you might be doing that has potential harms, but is unknown because that's the whole point, it's being tested. So you might be comparing an experimental group to find out if it has some particular impact relative to some kind of control group, and that needs to be explained. Description of all reasonably foreseeable risks and discomforts. So the researcher needs to identify what are reasonably anticipatable or reasonable foreseeable risks and list those in the consent form. And sometimes it's important to say that not all risks are foreseeable, and that there may be risks that have not yet been identified. It's important that for participants to understand that sometimes the process of research uncovers risks that were not anticipated when going into the study. Mentioned already, purpose of the study actually speaks to anticipated benefits of the research to either participants or society as a whole. Important to note that it's important to note that the study does not need to benefit the research participants directly. So you may be involved in research and be told that this study will have no direct benefits to you, but it must have some anticipated benefit to society as a whole. If there's compensation, then there needs to be a description of alternatives to participating in the research. So in the case of the research pool, participants are informed that they can either do research or they can write a survey. If it's a treatment of some kind, participants need to understand that if they have to be in the research in order to get a new experimental type of treatment, they need to be told how might they get their condition treated. What are their alternatives for getting treatment for their condition? Usually some sort of standard approach. Description of how confidentiality or identifying private information will be maintained. So how will the data have identifying information such as name or social security number? Will that information be removed from the data set? Will the data be stored in password protected computers? Will it be encrypted? All those kinds of things. For research involving more than minimal risk, is there any compensation that's going to be provided, especially if some sort of damage occurs? And is there medical treatment available, and who pays for that medical treatment if an injury occurs? There must be information about whom to contact for information about the research, as well as about their rights as research participants. So there needs to be contact information for the principal investigator, the person who is running the study, and there also has to be contact information for the IRB, the Institutional Review Board chairperson. And a statement that participation is voluntary, meaning they don't have to participate unless they absolutely want to, and that refusal to participate will incur no kind of penalty at all. And that participation can, in fact, be terminated or stopped at any time without penalty. All right, so these are the elements that must be in every informed consent form, regardless of the level of risk involved in the study and the anticipated benefits. Sometimes studies involve procedures that necessitate additional elements. So for example, An informed consent form might require a statement that the treatment or procedure may involve risks that are unknown to the participant. So, for example, it could be a risk to an embryo or a fetus if the participant becomes pregnant and what those risks involve. So when I was doing a study involving buprenorphine, we informed women that if they were to become pregnant, they would be removed from the study and referred to a specialty clinic for women who were with a history of heroin use who became pregnant. And that's a requirement. So they would be that there were unknown risks to the developing fetus from use of buprenorphine, and therefore they would be referred for a appropriate treatment and discontinued from the study. Circumstances under which the participant's involvement in the research will be terminated by the research without regard to the participant's consent. So if, for example, it's a treatment study and the participant gets worse as a result of the treatment, the researcher may remove the participant from the study and again refer them for appropriate treatment. Any additional cost to participants. So if you're doing a study that involves text messaging, it would be important to inform the person that they may be responsible for the cost of any texts that are sent or received. If a person is injured as a result of research, it's important that the researcher inform them if the researcher will be paying for that treatment or whether the participant themselves will have to cover the cost of any medical treatment required. Consequences of a participant's decision to withdraw from the research and procedures for doing so. So there are certain medications that you can't just stop. And so if a participant is included in a clinical trial involving a medication that may be dangerous to come off of abruptly, then the participant may need to hear that if they want to stop, that there are certain procedures that have to be followed in order to ensure that they can safely stop participating in the study. A statement that significant new findings developed during the course of the research, which may relate to the participant's willingness to continue participation, will be provided. So anything that gets discovered during the research that changes the risk-benefit ratio. Like I said, sometimes we go into a study not being aware of all the potential risks, but we identify risks as a result of participation through what's called adverse events. And if those adverse events are determined to be caused by the study procedures, then participants who originally consented have to be contacted and reconsented by informing them about the change in the anticipated risks, right? So we have become aware of these new potential risks and we want to know if you want to continue participating in the study. And sometimes it's important to know the approximate number of participants. This can be important if a study has small numbers of participants and the individual is unique enough that they might be identifiable based simply on their demographic characteristics, right? So if it's a sample of, say, 30 people from Towson and one of the participants is a biracial, gender non-binary individual, it may make them, plus additional other characteristics, it might make them sufficiently identifiable that there's no way to protect their privacy. That's important so that the person can decide, is my privacy more important than my involvement in the research? Okay, so that's all I want to say about ethics. All right.